The crystal chandeliers trembled first. Then came the sound, a low rumble that rattled the gilded frames along the palace walls, growing louder with each passing hour. In the Catherine Palace, just outside Leningrad in the autumn of 1941, Nazi officers worked by lamplight, their shadows dancing across walls that had witnessed 2 centuries of Russian splendor. They moved with desperate speed, carefully prying loose panels of honey-colored amber, each piece catching the light like frozen sunlight. 6 tons of precious material, gold-leafed, mirrors dyed, jewels embedded in Baroque designs so intricate they had taken craftsmen 10 years to complete. The Amber Room, the 8th wonder of the world, was being systematically dismantled and packed into 27 crates as Soviet artillery drew ever closer. Then it vanished. What happened next has consumed investigators, treasure hunters, and historians for more than 8 decades. Some who searched for it found only silence. Others found something worse. 5 theories attempt to explain where this priceless masterpiece disappeared to, and each one leads down a darker path than the last. Somewhere in the world, in a forgotten mine shaft, a secret chamber, or beneath tons of rubble, 6 tons of amber might still exist, hidden in absolute darkness, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps safeguarding secrets that were never meant to see daylight again. In the year 1701, in the heart of the Prussian court, a dream took form that would seduce emperors, survive wars, and whisper curses across 3 centuries. The Amber Room began not as a chamber, but as an obsession. An obsession with light, with beauty so intoxicating it would blur the line between craftsmanship and sorcery. Andreas Schluter, the Prussian court architect, conceived of something the world had never seen. Not merely a room, but a living jewel box, a space where the walls themselves would glow with organic warmth. He commissioned the Danish amber craftsman Gottfried Wolfram to transform his vision into reality. What they proposed seemed impossible. They would create an entire chamber paneled not with wood or stone, but with amber. 6 tons of it. Honey-colored, blood orange, golden brown, fossilized tree resin that had spent millions of years beneath the Baltic Sea, pressed and preserved, holding ancient sunlight within its translucent depth. The work began in 1701 and consumed 11 years of painstaking labor. Imagine the delicacy required. Amber is not wood to be sawed or stone to be carved. It is organic, temperamental, alive in its own way. Too much heat, and it cracks. Too much pressure, and it shatters. Each panel required thousands of precisely cut pieces, fitted together like an impossibly complex puzzle where no 2 fragments were identical. The craftsmen worked by candlelight in sealed workshops, breathing air thick with amber dust that coated their lungs and stained their fingers the color of old honey. The panels themselves were backed with gold leaf, so that when light passed through the amber, it would catch the gold and bounce back, creating a luminous effect that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. But the artisans did not stop there. They embedded the amber with precious stones, diamonds that caught the light like trapped stars, rubies that glowed like embers, jade and onyx and turquoise, each stone carefully selected to complement the warm spectrum of the amber. They installed mirrors at strategic intervals, angled to catch and multiply the candlelight, so that a single flame would become 100, and 100 would become 1,000, until the entire room seemed to pulse with golden fire. 4 Florentine mosaics, crafted from jasper and agate, depicted allegorical scenes of the senses and the arts. Each one took months to complete, each tiny stone fragment cut to fit precisely with its neighbors. The ceiling was painted with elaborate frescoes. The floor was inlaid with rare woods from distant lands, creating geometric patterns that seemed to shift as you walked across them. When the room was finally assembled in the Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin, those who entered it spoke of feeling drunk, intoxicated by beauty itself. But even in its creation, darkness gathered at the edges of the light. Gottfried Wolfram, the master craftsman, who had devoted more than a decade to the room's construction, died before seeing his work completed. Some said it was the amber dust that destroyed his lungs. Others whispered that the room itself had drained the life from him, demanding more than any mortal should give. 3 other craftsmen died during the construction, their deaths attributed to workshop accidents, falls from scaffolding, sudden illnesses that came without warning. The workers began to speak nervously among themselves. They noticed that ownership of the amber seemed to bring misfortune. Raw amber merchants who handled the largest shipments often suffered financial ruin or family tragedy shortly after the sales were complete. Frederick I of Prussia, who had commissioned the room, barely had time to enjoy his creation. He died in 1713, just 2 years after the room's completion. His son, Frederick William I, cared nothing for such extravagance. He was a soldier king, a man of military discipline who saw the amber room as frivolous excess, a monument to vanity he wanted no part of. The room sat neglected, its golden glow dimmed, gathering dust in a palace where no one wished to enter it. Then came 1716, and with it, an opportunity to rid Prussia of its beautiful burden. Tsar Peter the Great of Russia visited Berlin, and Frederick William I saw his chance. Peter was famously difficult to impress, a giant of a man who had worked as a ship's carpenter and pulled the teeth of his own courtiers to practice dentistry. But when Peter entered the amber room, witnesses say his face changed. The hard lines softened. His eyes widened like a child seeing magic for the first time. He moved through the space slowly, running his massive hands along the glowing panels, watching his reflection multiply in the mirrors until there seemed to be dozens of him, all bathed in golden light. Frederick William seized the moment. He offered the room as a gift, a gesture of alliance between Prussia and Russia. Peter accepted immediately, and in return, he gifted Frederick William a regiment of his tallest soldiers, knowing the Prussian king's obsession with military height and discipline. Historians call it a diplomatic masterstroke. Others would later wonder if Frederick William simply wanted to pass the curse along to someone else's palace. The dismantling and transport of the amber room became an epic undertaking. Each panel had to be carefully removed, wrapped, catalogued, and packed into crates. The journey to Russia covered more than 1,600 kilometers, over rough roads that could shatter the delicate amber with a single wrong bump. Remarkably, the room survived the journey intact, though 2 craftsmen involved in the transport died along the way. One fell through ice while crossing a frozen river. The other simply disappeared one night, his body never found. The amber room arrived in St. Petersburg in 1717, but Peter the Great, distracted by wars and shipbuilding, never properly installed it. The crate sat unopened for decades. It was not until 1755, under the reign of Tsarina Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, that the room finally found its true home in the Catherine Palace, about 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, in the town, then called Tsarskoye Selo. The Italian architect Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli was commissioned to install and expand the room. The original Berlin chamber had been relatively modest, designed for a smaller space. Rastrelli had to work with Russian craftsmen to create additional amber panels to fit the much larger hall Elizabeth had designated for it. They sourced more Baltic amber, duplicated the techniques of the original craftsmen, and expanded the room to cover more than 55 square meters of wall space. It took them years, but when they finished, the result surpassed even the original vision. The amber room had become something more than human hands should have been able to create. Visitors described entering the room as stepping into the heart of the sun. During the day, natural light from the tall windows would make the amber glow with warm radiance. At night, when hundreds of candles were lit for balls and state dinners, the effect became almost hallucinogenic. The mirrors multiplied the light infinitely. The gold leaf behind the amber created depth, making the walls seem to recede into glowing distances. The precious stones caught and threw light in unexpected directions. Guests reported feeling disoriented, unable to judge distances properly, seeing phantom reflections that moved at the corners of their vision. Catherine the Great, who succeeded to the throne in 1762, used the room to impress foreign dignitaries and intimidate rivals. She understood the psychological power of beauty, how it could be weaponized to demonstrate wealth and taste that could never be matched. She would receive ambassadors in the amber room, watching their composure crumble as they tried to focus on diplomatic negotiations while surrounded by impossible beauty. The room became known as the eighth wonder of the world, and Catherine encouraged the nickname, understanding that wonder and fear often occupy the same space in the human heart. But the pattern continued. Those who spent the most time in the room seemed to suffer for it. Catherine's favorite advisors, who conducted business in the chamber, had a troubling tendency toward early deaths, sudden illnesses, or dramatic falls from grace. During her reign, 3 different ministers who regularly met with her in the Amber Room died under mysterious circumstances. One fell from a window. One was found dead in his study with no apparent cause. One disappeared while traveling, his carriage found abandoned on a remote road, as if he had simply stepped out and walked into the forest, never to return. The room itself seemed to resist preservation. Despite careful maintenance, the amber would occasionally crack without warning. Stones would work loose from their settings. Mirrors would develop strange flaws that could not be polished away. The craftsmen tasked with repairs spoke of feeling watched while they worked, of cold spots that had no source, of tools that would be in one place when they set them down and in another when they reached for them moments later. For more than 2 centuries, the Amber Room remained in Catherine Palace, surviving revolutions and upheavals, its golden glow unchanged while empires rose and fell around it. Those who possessed it gained legendary status. But they never kept it for long, and they never kept their peace. The room waited, beautiful and patient, holding its light close like a secret it would never tell, while the shadows in its corners grew deeper, and the curse it carried prepared for its next chapter, its darkest transformation, in a century that would prove even more brutal than those that came before. The night sky over Königsberg glowed orange on the 29th of August 1945. British Lancaster bombers descended through clouds of smoke, their payloads aimed at what remained of the Prussian city. Below them, in the medieval vaults of Königsberg Castle, one of humanity's greatest treasures lay hidden in wooden crates, waiting in the darkness. The Amber Room, that magnificent chamber of golden resin and mirrors that had once graced the Catherine Palace, had journeyed through war-torn Europe to this final resting place. What happened next would become the most accepted explanation for its disappearance, though acceptance has never quite silenced the whispers of doubt. The German records tell a straightforward story, at least on paper. Alfred Rohde, the director of the Königsberg art collections, had meticulously documented the arrival of the Amber Room panels in 1941. His inventories described the careful dismantling of the amber panels from their original home, each piece numbered and catalogued before being packed into specially constructed crates. The paperwork shows that these crates were transported to Königsberg Castle and placed in secure storage in the castle's basement vaults. Rohde was a careful man, perhaps too careful. His last known correspondence mentions the Amber Room's location explicitly, a detail that would later seem either helpful or haunting, depending on how you interpret what came after. The castle basement where the crates rested was a labyrinth of medieval stonework, chambers that had stood for centuries, built to withstand sieges and storms. The vaults maintained a constant cool temperature, ideal for preserving artworks and artifacts. German officials believed these ancient walls would protect their treasures better than any modern facility. They were wrong, but not for the reasons they might have imagined. When the Allied bombers appeared that late August night, Königsberg was already a broken city. Earlier raids had devastated the civilian quarters, leaving thousands dead and much of the historic center in ruins. But the castle had survived, its thick walls and strategic positions sparing it from the worst of the destruction. That was about to change. The bombing raid of August 29th was different in scale and intensity. Wave after wave of aircraft appeared, dropping incendiary bombs that turned the night into artificial day. Survivors of that night, the few who remained near the castle district, described scenes that seemed pulled from apocalyptic visions. The incendiary devices burst across the castle's rooftops, releasing liquid fire that clung to stone and wood alike. The ancient timbers that had supported the structure's interior for hundreds of years became fuel for an inferno. Witnesses spoke of flames so bright you could read a newspaper in the streets below, of heat so intense that glass melted in windows 3 blocks away. The castle burned for 4 days straight. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. 4 days of continuous fire, feeding on centuries of accumulated wooden beams, furniture, tapestries, and whatever else lay within those walls. The temperature inside the vaults, those supposedly protective chambers, must have risen to unimaginable levels. Stone itself began to crack from thermal stress, the mortar between blocks turning to powder and dust. Here's where the scientific reality becomes important. Amber, for all its beauty and historical significance, is not a resilient material when exposed to extreme heat. It begins to soften at temperatures around 150 degrees Celsius. At 250 degrees, it melts. At 300 degrees, it ignites and burns with a thick, acrid smoke. The fire that consumed Königsberg Castle burned far hotter than any of these thresholds. Firefighters who finally attempted to control the blaze, days after it began, estimated temperatures in the central areas exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. Nothing organic could have survived that heat. Wood turned to ash, fabrics vanished, and amber would have first melted, then burned, leaving behind only the faintest chemical residue. Soviet investigators arrived in April of 1946, once the Red Army had fully secured the region and the ruins had cooled enough to permit careful examination. The man leading this investigation was Anatoly Kuchumov, a specialist in Imperial Russian art who had dedicated much of his career to cataloging the treasures of the Catherine Palette. He knew the Amber Room intimately, had studied its every panel and decoration before the war. If anyone could identify fragments or traces of its existence, Kuchumov could. What he found in the castle's basement vaults told a grim story. The chambers were filled with ash, debris, and the twisted remains of storage crates. Metal fixtures and hinges lay scattered among the rubble, the wood they once held together completely consumed. Kuchumov's team sifted through tons of ash and debris with archaeological precision. They found fragments of amber, small pieces, no larger than a fingernail, scattered throughout the destruction. These fragments showed clear signs of exposure to intense heat, their surfaces bubbled and blackened. Chemical analysis confirmed they were Baltic amber, consistent with the materials used in the Amber Room's construction. Kuchumov documented everything with scientific rigor. His reports described the pattern of destruction, the way fire had moved through the vaults, the evidence of sustained high temperatures. He interviewed German citizens who had worked at the castle, survivors who remembered seeing the crated panels in storage. Their testimonies aligned with the documentary evidence. The Amber Room had been there, in those vaults, when the bombs fell and the fires began. The official conclusion seemed inescapable. The Amber Room, one of the world's most magnificent artistic achievements, had been destroyed in the bombing of Königsberg Castle. It had survived 200 years of Russian history, revolution and war, only to be consumed by flames in a basement vault in Prussia. The melting point of amber had sealed its fate. This explanation satisfied the official inquiries. Case closed, mystery solved, tragedy documented. Except the story refuses to end cleanly. Some of the crates documented in Rodi's inventories were never accounted for in the ruins. The counts didn't match. Kuchumov noted this discrepancy in his reports, but attributed it to the chaotic conditions of wartime record-keeping. Perhaps the inventories were incomplete. Perhaps some items had been moved before the bombing. Perhaps the destruction was so complete that evidence of some crates simply vanished. But perhaps is a word that leaves room for doubt to grow. Then there were the witness testimonies that didn't fit the accepted narrative. A German woman named Gerda, who lived in the streets near the castle, told Soviet investigators that she had seen SS trucks at the castle's service entrance 3 days before the bombing. She remembered because it struck her as odd. By late August of 1945, the war was clearly lost. The Red Army was closing in from the east. What could the SS possibly be doing at the castle so close to the end? Moving artworks to safety, she assumed at the time. But to where? And why would this not appear in official records? A former Wehrmacht soldier, captured and questioned during the Soviet investigation, claimed he had been part of a detail that helped load heavy crates onto trucks in the final days before the bombing. He couldn't say what was in the crates. Orders were orders, and soldiers didn't ask questions, but he remembered they were treated with unusual care. Special padding, careful handling, officers supervising every movement. The timeline he described placed this activity in the last week of August, just days before the castle burned. These testimonies create uncomfortable questions. If the Amber Room was destroyed in the fire, why were trucks removing crates just before the bombing? If all the panels were in the basement vaults when the incendiaries fell, why don't the inventory numbers match the forensic evidence? The gaps are small enough to dismiss as wartime confusion, but large enough to nurture doubt. Some researchers have pointed out the convenient timing of the castle's destruction. The bombing eliminated any definitive proof of what had or hadn't been stored in those vaults. Ash and rubble tell only so much. A few amber fragments prove that some amount of the material was present, but they don't prove that every panel, every piece, every component of the room was there when the flames came. Could the bombing have provided perfect cover for an earlier removal? If someone had spirited away the amber room in those final chaotic days of the war, the fire would have erased most evidence of the theft. The psychology of this possibility is fascinating. We want closure, prefer clean narratives that tie up loose ends. The bombing explanation provides that closure. It's tragic but comprehensible, a masterpiece lost to the chaos of war, like so many other treasures destroyed in the conflict. But the human mind also rebels against accepting such losses without proof. We want to believe that something so beautiful might have survived, that perhaps somewhere in a sealed vault or forgotten bunker, the amber panels wait to be rediscovered. Alfred Rode himself died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the Soviet occupation, along with his wife. Both deaths were attributed to typhus, but the timing raised questions. Did Rode know something about the amber room's final disposition that died with him? His meticulous records end abruptly in the weeks before the bombing, unusual for such a careful documenter. The official explanation holds considerable weight. The physical evidence of destruction, the scientific reality of amber's vulnerability to heat, the witness accounts of the intense fire. All these factors support the conclusion that the amber room burned in Königsberg Castle. It's the answer that best fits the available facts. But facts have a way of leaving shadows where certainty should be. Was the bombing of Königsberg Castle simply a military action that coincidentally destroyed one of history's greatest treasures? Or was it something more convenient, a funeral pyre that consumed evidence along with amber? The question lingers in those gaps between inventory numbers, in the memory of trucks arriving before the flames, in the convenient disappearance of the one man who knew for certain what those crates contained. We may never know if the amber room truly died in that fire, or if somewhere beyond the reach of records and ruins, it waits in darkness, preserved not by accident but by design. The Baltic Sea keeps its secrets in darkness nearly impenetrable, in depths where sunlight fades to memory, and the cold presses against metal and bone with equal indifference. Somewhere in those black waters, according to treasure hunters who have devoted their lives and fortunes to the search, lies one of the greatest artistic treasures ever created by human hands. The amber room, they believe, rests not in a forgotten mine shaft or a hidden bunker, but in the flooded corridors of a Nazi ship, entombed beneath waves that have guarded it for nearly 80 years. The theory centers on those final desperate days of World War II, when the Third Reich collapsed like a burning house and everything inside had to be moved, hidden, or destroyed. In early 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Baltic coast, the Nazi evacuation became a frantic race against time. Ships that had once carried troops to conquest now served as escape vessels for refugees, wounded soldiers, and according to persistent reports, crates filled with treasures looted from across Europe. The ports of Gdansk, Gdynia, and Königsberg became scenes of controlled chaos, with thousands pressing toward the docks and captains making impossible decisions about what and who could be saved. Among the vessels pressed into this desperate service was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a cruise liner that had once represented Nazi propaganda at its most polished, hosting pleasure trips for German workers under the Strength Through Joy program. By January of 1945, the ship had been stripped of its peacetime elegance and converted for military use. On January 30th, it departed from Gotenhafen, now Gdynia in Poland, carrying what witnesses estimated as more than 10,000 people, though exact numbers remain disputed. The passenger manifest included submarine trainees, wounded soldiers, Nazi officials fleeing Soviet advance, and civilians desperate to escape the Red Army's approach. Some survivors would later speak of military trucks loading unmarked crates into the cargo holds under armed guard in the hours before departure. Contents unknown, but clearly valuable enough to merit space on an already overcrowded vessel. The Wilhelm Gustloff never reached its destination. At approximately 9 in the evening, Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko, fired 3 torpedoes that struck the ship in rapid succession. The vessel listed heavily, its corridors becoming death traps as passengers struggled through darkness toward exits that led to freezing water. The death toll exceeded 9,000 people, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. The ship sank in less than 40 minutes, settling on the seabed at a depth of approximately 45 meters in the cold waters between Germany and Poland. For decades, the Wilhelm Gustloff remained primarily a human tragedy, a reminder of war's civilian cost. But as stories about Nazi treasure trains and hidden hoards gained traction in the late 20th century, some researchers began asking different questions. What had been in those crates, loaded under military guard? Could the Amber Room, missing since its presumed evacuation from Königsberg in January of 1945, have been aboard a ship fleeing from exactly that location at exactly that time? The timeline supports the possibility. Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April of 1945, but the bombing of the city had begun months earlier. Alfred Rohde, the curator who oversaw the Amber Room's installation in Königsberg Castle, reported that the panels were still intact in August of 1944, though packed for safety. By November, Allied bombs had damaged the castle significantly. At some point between those dates and the Soviet arrival, the Amber Room vanished. The window for evacuation by sea remained open until late January, when Soviet forces cut off most escape routes. The Wilhelm Gustloff departed January 30th. The dates align with uncomfortable precision. Treasure hunters who advocate for this theory point to sonar imaging conducted over the wreck site during expeditions in the early 2000s. Karl-Heinz Kleine, a German researcher who dedicated 15 years to studying the Wilhelm Gustloff, claimed that side-scan sonar detected rectangular objects in the cargo holds that matched the approximate dimensions of the Amber Room panel. These objects, he insisted, showed acoustic properties consistent with dense organic material rather than typical military cargo. The measurements corresponded to what survivors of the loading process described: large crates handled with extreme care and positioned in the most secure area of the hold. But detecting something with sonar and reaching it with human hands are vastly different challenges. The Baltic Sea, despite being relatively shallow compared to oceans, presents unique dangers. The water temperature hovers just above freezing year-round at depth. Visibility approaches zero in many areas due to sediment and algae bloom. The wreck itself has become unstable after decades of corrosion, making entry into the cargo holds a potentially fatal risk. Several expeditions have attempted to explore the Wilhelm Gustloff more thoroughly, and several have ended in precisely the kind of accidents that make other divers reconsider the attempt. In 2003, a Polish diving team received permission to survey the wreck site. The expedition was well-funded and professionally organized, with experienced technical divers and state-of-the-art equipment. On their third dive into the cargo area, equipment failures began cascading in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Communication systems malfunctioned first, leaving the dive team unable to coordinate. Then pressure regulators began behaving erratically, feeding air in inconsistent bursts that forced the divers to abort and surface more quickly than safety protocols recommended. One diver, whose name was withheld in official reports but circulated among diving communities as Thomas, later described seeing something through the murk that caught light in a way metal does not. A golden glint, he said, rectangular and regular, visible for perhaps 3 seconds before sediment clouded the water again. He reached toward it, hand extended into darkness, before his equipment failure forced him upward toward the surface and light. That expedition ended without recovering anything and without conclusive proof of what the glint might have been. The team's leader refused to authorize another attempt, citing safety concerns and what he described as an uncomfortable feeling about the entire site. Other divers who have worked on the wreck speak of it in similar terms, as a place that does not want to be explored, that guards its contents through misfortune rather than physical barriers. The Wilhelm Gustloff is not the only candidate for an underwater tomb of Nazi treasure. The Karlsruhe, a German light cruiser scuttled in the final days of the war, has attracted attention from researchers who believe it might have carried looted art southward along the coast before its deliberate sinking. The Deutschland, another vessel torpedoed during the evacuation, reportedly had sealed cargo holds that witnesses claimed contained crates from museums and castles in the east. Each shipwreck becomes another possibility, another dark space that might contain something priceless, or might contain only rusted metal and bones. The theory gained unexpected credibility in 2020 when Polish divers working on the wreck of the SS Karlsruhe announced they had recovered approximately 200 kilograms of gold. The find consisted of ingots and coins dated to the Nazi period, confirming what historians had long suspected but could not prove. The Nazi evacuation by sea had indeed included treasure, valuable material deemed worth the risk and the cargo space, even as thousands of refugees pleaded for passage. If gold made it onto these ships, the reasoning goes, why not amber panels? Why not art and antiquities and all the other plunder that filled warehouses across the conquered territories? The discovery transformed the Baltic treasure hunt from fringe theory to recognized possibility. Major news outlets covered the gold recovery. Museums began reassessing their own missing items, wondering if their lost collections might rest not in forgotten warehouses, but in flooded shipholds. And the number of expedition requests for the Wilhelm Gustloff site increased dramatically, though Polish authorities who control access to the wreck remain cautious about granting permission. The site is a war grave after all, containing the remains of thousands. Disturbing it for treasure recovery presents ethical questions that have no comfortable answers. But treasure hunters are persistent creatures, driven by a hunger that transcends rational risk assessment. They study the currents and the historical records. They plot the routes of every ship that left the Baltic ports in those final months. They interview elderly survivors, who might remember details about cargo or conversations overheard on crowded decks. And they return to the sonar images, to those rectangular shapes in the darkness that might be crates of carefully packed amber, or might be nothing more than collapsed furniture, or rusted equipment arranged by chance into dimensions that tempt the imagination. The sea keeps its secrets better than any vault designed by human engineering. It does not require guards or alarms, only depth and cold and time. What sinks into those waters becomes part of a different world, one where the rules change and human confidence dissolves like salt in the current. Divers who work at depth speak of the psychological weight that accompanies the physical pressure, the understanding that surfaces with each breath that they have entered a place fundamentally hostile to their survival. And when they search for something specific, something valuable, that psychological burden increases. Every shadow might contain treasure. Every equipment malfunction might prevent its discovery. The mind, starved of light and reliable sensory input, begins to construct narratives from insufficient data. Yet, the theory persists because it answers questions that other explanations leave open. Where did the amber room go? How could something so large and distinctive simply vanish? The Baltic Sea provides a solution that requires no conspiracy of silence, no hidden bunker that somehow escaped 75 years of intensive searching. The room went down with a ship, the theory suggests, claimed by torpedoes and war and the same chaos that killed thousands. It rests now in darkness, surrounded by wreckage and the remnants of lives ended too soon, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to descend through the cold water and claim it. Whether that person will ever arrive remains an open question. Technology improves with each passing year, making previously impossible dives more feasible. But the Baltic keeps adding sediment, keeps corroding metal, keeps making the wrecks more unstable and more dangerous. There may come a time when the Wilhelm Gustloff collapses entirely, when the cargo holds become inaccessible even to robots and remote cameras. If the amber room is there, it may remain there forever, golden glints in the darkness seen by fewer eyes with each passing decade, until finally the sea completes its work and even the possibility fades to legend. The deep water holds its mysteries close, and not all of them are meant to be solved by those who breathe air and fear the dark. The darkness beneath the earth holds memories that some believe should never be disturbed. Deep below the forests of Germany and Poland, an elaborate network of tunnels and underground chambers winds through the bedrock like the arteries of some massive sleeping beast. These are not natural caves worn smooth by water and time. These are the creations of desperate hands in the final years of the Second World War, carved with purpose, reinforced with concrete and steel, designed to hide what the Third Reich valued most. And somewhere in this subterranean labyrinth, many believe, lies the greatest missing treasure of all, the Amber Room. The theory seems almost too obvious when you first encounter it. Where else would the Nazis hide something so precious, so irreplaceable, if not in the very places they constructed specifically for such purposes? The logic is seductive. As the Allied forces closed in from both east and west during 1944 and 1945, the German military frantically moved art, gold, documents, and weapons into underground facilities across their shrinking territory. Trainloads of treasures disappeared into mountain tunnels. Entire museum collections vanished into mines that had been repurposed as vaults. The Amber Room, dismantled and crated after its theft from the Catherine Palace near Leningrad, would have been among the most valuable prizes to protect. It makes perfect sense that it would have gone underground. But sense and certainty are different things entirely, and the underground world of Nazi tunnels offers only riddles wrapped in darkness and danger. The Mamerki bunker complex sits in northeastern Poland, near what was once the East Prussian heartland of the Reich. This was not a small operation. Mamerki was built as a backup headquarters, a shadow facility to the more famous Wolf's Lair, where Hitler coordinated much of the Eastern Front. The complex sprawls across acres of land, most of it invisible from the surface. 80 bunkers and structures once stood here, connected by underground passages that snake through the soil like the roots of some poisonous tree. Many of these structures have collapsed over the decades since the war. Others remain, though time and weather have not been kind. Those who have explored Mamerki describe an atmosphere that presses in on you the moment you descend below ground. The air changes quality, becomes heavier somehow, laden with moisture, and the smell of concrete slowly returning to dust. Your flashlight beam reaches only so far before the darkness swallows it. The tunnels branch and turn, some leading to chambers that still show signs of their original purpose. Ventilation shafts, electrical conduits, long since stripped of their wiring alcoves where guards might have stood watch. Other passages end abruptly in walls of rubble where the ceiling has given way, or in pools of stagnant water that reflect your light back at you, like dead eyes. In 1997, a team of researchers obtained permission to conduct a systematic exploration of the deeper levels at Mamerki, levels that had been sealed since the Soviet occupation. They were looking specifically for evidence of storage chambers, places where valuable cargo might have been kept in those final chaotic months of the war. What they found was tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. Several chambers, each roughly 10 meters by 12 meters, showed clear signs of having been used for storage. Wooden pallets had rotted into the floor. Metal brackets on the walls suggested shelving or securing points for large objects. But the chambers were empty. Completely, utterly empty. The expedition leader, a historian named Andreas Richter, later described the experience in an interview with a German documentary team. He spoke of the feeling that they had arrived too late, that someone else had been there first. The chambers were too clean, he insisted. After 50 years of abandonment, you would expect debris, bat droppings, evidence of animal intrusion. Instead, the floors showed scratch marks consistent with heavy objects being dragged across them. Some of these marks looked disturbingly fresh, though Richter acknowledged this might have been a trick of preservation in the sealed environment. What bothered him most was a single boot print they found in a silted corner, made by a modern hiking boot, not military issue from the 1940s. Someone had been in those sealed chambers within the last decade. The Stolzenhain mine system presents an even more elaborate puzzle. Located in Lower Silesia, now part of Poland near the German border, Stolzenhain was one of dozens of underground facilities constructed in the final years of the Reich. The complex was never finished. The war ended before the grand plans could be realized, leaving behind a maze of completed tunnels, half-carved chambers, and ambitious blueprints that were never implemented. But the portions that were completed are vast beyond easy comprehension. Miles of tunnels branch through the hillside, connecting chambers large enough to hide locomotives, descending to levels that flood seasonally with groundwater from the nearby river system. The legend of the Nazi treasure train centers strongly on Stolzenhain. According to accounts from the immediate post-war period, witnesses reported seeing heavily guarded trains enter certain tunnels in the spring of 1945, trains that never emerged. The entrances to these tunnels were subsequently destroyed, sealed with explosives that brought thousands of tons of rock down to block the passages. Soviet troops occupying the region immediately after the war reportedly attempted to excavate some of these collapsed entrances, but gave up after several fatal accidents. The official Soviet reports claimed they found nothing of value. Local residents have always doubted this claim. Among the many treasure hunters and amateur historians drawn to Stolzenhain over the decades, few were as dedicated or as obsessed as Karl-Heinz Kleine. A former mining engineer from Saxony, Kleine became convinced in the early 1980s that the Amber Room lay somewhere in the Stolzenhain complex. He spent years researching, tracking down elderly witnesses who had lived in the area during the war, obtaining copies of German military documents from various archives, and comparing geological surveys with wartime construction records. By 1986, he claimed to have narrowed the location to a specific section of tunnel on the complex's lowest accessible level. Kleine was not a reckless man. His background in mining gave him a healthy respect for the dangers of underground exploration. He knew about toxic gases that could accumulate in sealed spaces, about the instability of tunnels that had been neglected for 40 years, about the very real possibility of getting lost in passages that branched and doubled back on themselves without clear marking. He prepared carefully for his expedition into Stolzenhain, assembling proper safety equipment, recruiting 2 experienced cavers to accompany him, and filing detailed plans with local authorities about where he intended to explore. In March of 1987, Kleine and his 2 companions entered the Stolzenhain tunnels. They were equipped with gas detectors, emergency oxygen, climbing gear, and enough lights to illuminate a small stadium. They also carried maps, both historical documents Kleine had obtained, and his own hand-drawn charts showing what he believed was the route to a sealed chamber that might contain the Amber Room. The expedition was supposed to last 2 days, with the team camping overnight in one of the larger, more stable chambers near the entrance. They emerged after 36 hours, exhausted and shaken. According to the 2 companions, they had indeed found a section of tunnel that matched Kleine's research, a passage that ended in a deliberately constructed wall of concrete and brick rather than a natural rock face. Behind that wall, Kleine was convinced, lay a chamber containing the treasure he sought. They had taken photographs, measurements, and samples of the mortar for analysis. Kleine was elated. He spoke of returning with proper excavation equipment, of finally solving the mystery that had consumed him for years. 3 weeks later, Karl-Heinz Kleine was dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was 53 years old, with no previous history of cardiac problems. He died alone in his apartment, and his body was not discovered for 2 days. When police entered the apartment, they found it in disarray. Papers were scattered across every surface, file cabinets stood open, and Kleine's desk looked as though someone had swept everything off it in a violent gesture. The photographs from the Stolzenhain expedition were gone. The maps, both the historical documents and Kleine's own carefully annotated charts, had vanished. The mortar samples were missing from the labeled evidence bags that remained on his work table. The 2 companions who had accompanied Kleine into the tunnels were questioned. Both told the same story. Kleine had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks following the expedition. He claimed he was being followed. He said his apartment had been searched while he was out, though nothing appeared to be missing during those earlier intrusions. He had stopped answering his phone. The last time either companion spoke with him, 4 days before his death, Kleine had said something that stuck with them both. He told them that he had made copies of everything, hidden them somewhere safe, and if anything happened to him, someone would know where to look. No such copies were ever found. No one came forward claiming to know their location. The official investigation concluded there was no evidence of foul play. Heart attacks happen. Paranoia can be a symptom of stress or mental illness. The missing documents could have been taken by Kleine himself, hidden somewhere, or even destroyed in a moment of irrationality. The case was closed. But among the community of treasure hunters and Amber Room researchers, Kleine's death became another data point in a pattern that some found deeply troubling. He was not the first person to claim proximity to the Amber Room's location, who subsequently died under questionable circumstances. He would not be the last. Modern expeditions into places like Stolzenhain and the murky face obstacles that go beyond the physical dangers of unstable tunnels and toxic air. There are legal restrictions now, heritage protection laws that limit who can explore these sites and what they can do once inside. The Polish and German governments have declared many of the tunnel systems protected historical monuments. which sounds respectful until you realize it effectively means they are off limits to serious investigation. Official archaeological teams occasionally receive permission for limited surveys, but these are constrained by safety regulations and budget limitations. They scratch the surface, document what they can reach easily, and withdraw. Independent explorers who venture into these places anyway, without permission, find themselves in a different kind of darkness. The tunnels themselves seem to resist intrusion. Every experienced cave explorer knows that underground environments can be dangerous, but those who have spent time in the Nazi tunnel systems report something beyond normal hazard. Tunnels collapse without apparent cause. Equipment fails in ways that seem almost deliberately timed. Groups become separated despite careful precautions. There is a feeling, difficult to articulate but widely reported, that these places do not want to be explored, that they are holding their secrets with a kind of malevolent intent. In 2009, a team of 4 urban explorers from Germany entered a section of tunnel near the former Mamerki complex, accessing it through a partially collapsed entrance they had located using ground-penetrating radar. They were filming their expedition, hoping to create a documentary about the search for Nazi treasures. The footage they captured, later uploaded to various websites, shows the initial descent, the rubble-strewn entrance, the first intact corridor stretching away into darkness, the excitement in their voices as they move deeper. Then the footage becomes confused. The camera jerks wildly. Someone is shouting about gas, though their detectors show nothing. Another voice screams that the tunnel is collapsing, though the visible walls and ceiling appear stable. The image spins, catches a glimpse of panicked faces in the harsh LED light, then cuts to black. All 4 explorers made it out alive, though one suffered a broken leg in the scramble to escape. When interviewed later, their accounts were contradictory. Some insisted they had encountered toxic gas despite what their instruments showed. Others claimed the tunnel had begun to collapse, that they heard the groan of shifting rock and the crack of concrete giving way. The footage shows none of this. The footage shows 4 people suddenly, simultaneously gripped by terror and running for the exit. The most unsettling detail comes at the end of their published video. In the final seconds before the camera cuts out, as the person filming turns to run, the light briefly illuminates a side passage they had not yet explored. And in that passage, for just a fraction of a second, there appears to be a figure standing in the darkness, watching them flee. The figure could be anything: a trick of shadow, a piece of broken equipment catching the light, the imagination of viewers primed to see something sinister. But the explorers themselves refused to discuss it. They have declined all subsequent invitations to return or to analyze the footage in detail. Their documentary was never completed. There are documents, fragments of Nazi bureaucracy, that survived the war's end, that seem to support the theory that something valuable was indeed hidden in the underground complexes. A logistics report from February 1945, discovered in East German archives in the 1990s, references special cargo being transferred to underground storage facility, designation A7. The report is maddeningly vague about what the cargo contained, but it notes that the transport required specialized handling and climate-controlled storage. The amber room, fragile and sensitive to temperature and humidity changes, would have required exactly such conditions. Facility A7 has never been definitively identified, though several researchers believe it corresponds to a section of the Stolzenhain complex that remains inaccessible due to flooding. Another document, this one, a partially burned memo recovered from a bunker outside Berlin, includes a list of items to be prioritized for preservation. The list includes gold reserves, certain weapons research materials, and what is described as cultural items of exceptional value from occupied territory. The amber panels are not mentioned by name, but they would certainly qualify. The memo is dated April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, and bears the stamp of the Reich Chancellery. It suggests that even in those final desperate days, resources were being allocated to hide treasures underground. But documents can only tell you so much. They can suggest, imply, create tantalizing possibilities. They cannot lead you through kilometers of flooded tunnel to a chamber that may or may not exist. They cannot protect you from the very real dangers that wait below ground. The pockets of methane and carbon dioxide that can kill in minutes, the unstable walls held up by rusted supports that have been corroding for 80 years, the absolute darkness that disorients and terrifies in ways that those who have not experienced it cannot truly understand. The claustrophobic theory of the Amber Room holds a particular psychological power. It combines our fascination with lost treasures, our horror of enclosed spaces, and our awareness that the earth keeps secrets we may never be permitted to discover. Somewhere below our feet, the theory suggests, in tunnels that flood and collapse and resist exploration, lies something beautiful that was stolen and then hidden and perhaps can never be recovered. The room exists but remains unreachable, like a memory you cannot quite grasp or a dream that fades the moment you try to examine it closely. And in the dark tunnels, perhaps, the truth waits with the patience of stone, guarded by shadows and the fear that keeps most people from looking too deeply into places where the light has not reached for generations. The war ended in May of 1945, but the mystery of the Amber Room had only just begun. As the Third Reich crumbled and Allied forces swept through what remained of Nazi Germany, investigators immediately began searching for the world's most precious, plundered treasure. They expected to find it hidden in a bunker, tucked away in a salt mine, or stored in some forgotten warehouse. What they discovered instead was far more troubling. The Amber Room had simply vanished. No single location could account for its disappearance. No witness could provide a definitive answer. And as the decades passed, a darker theory began to take shape, one that suggested the room had never been destroyed at all, but had been carefully dismantled, piece by piece, and scattered across the globe like seeds in the wind. The traditional narrative insisted that the Amber Room had been lost during the bombing of Königsberg, consumed by flames when Allied forces attacked the city in 1944. Soviet investigators accepted this explanation, eventually giving up their search and declaring the treasure lost to history. But there were always those who refused to believe in such a convenient ending. The room had survived 200 years, had been meticulously cared for, had weathered revolution and war. Could it really have been reduced to ash in a single night? Or had something far more calculated taken place in those final months of the war, when Nazi officers knew defeat was inevitable and began planning their escape? Among those who questioned the official story was a small group of researchers who noticed a curious pattern emerging in the post-war years. Fragments of amber began appearing in unexpected places, always mysterious in origin, always lacking clear provenance. A piece here discovered in the estate sale of a deceased German officer. Another there, found tucked away in a safety deposit box that had gone unclaimed for decades. Each fragment was expertly carved. Each bore the unmistakable craftsmanship of 18th century Russian artisans. And each raised the same unsettling question. If the Amber Room had truly been destroyed, where were these pieces coming from? The theory that began to coalesce suggested something far more sinister than simple destruction. According to this view, high-ranking Nazi officers had made a calculated decision in the waning days of the war. They knew the Third Reich would fall. They knew they would be hunted as war criminals. But they also knew that art and treasure could be converted into new identities, into safe passage, into comfortable lives far from the rubble of Europe. The Amber Room, too large and too famous to move as a single unit, was instead disassembled into manageable pieces. Each panel was carefully removed from its frame. Each carved amber element was wrapped and packed. And then, according to the theory, these pieces were distributed among trusted officers, men who were already planning their disappearances, who had already secured false papers, and arranged for transportation to distant corners of the world. One of the most compelling accounts supporting this theory came from a man named Georg Stein, a former Wehrmacht soldier who served in East Prussia during the final years of the war. Stein never spoke publicly about what he knew, but on his deathbed in 1991, he told his son a story that would send researchers scrambling. According to Stein, he had been part of a special unit tasked with protecting valuable items in Königsberg Castle as the Soviet army approached. In January of 1945, he and several other soldiers were ordered to help dismantle the Amber Room under the supervision of Dr. Alfred Rohde, the director of the Königsberg art collections. Stein described how they worked through the night, carefully removing each panel, wrapping them in heavy cloth, and loading them into wooden crates. But here is where his account diverged from others. The crates, he said, were not all sent to the same location. Different officers took different pieces, each man responsible for his assigned portion of the treasure. Stein claimed that he personally helped load 3 crates onto a truck driven by an SS officer whose name he either never knew or chose not to reveal. The officer, according to Stein, was destined for South America, one of thousands of Nazi officials who would eventually make their way along the so-called rat lines, the secret escape routes that smuggled war criminals out of Europe and into sympathetic countries across the Atlantic. The panels in those 3 crates, Stein told his son, were meant to fund a new life in Argentina, where many former Nazis had already established communities, businesses, and in some cases, entire compounds hidden in the remote countryside. Stein's son brought his father's testimony to researchers who had been tracking amber fragments for years. What they found seemed to support at least part of his account. In 1997, a piece of amber mosaic matching the description and style of the amber room was discovered in Bremen, Germany, in the possession of the family of a deceased former officer. The family claimed they had no idea where it came from, that it had been among their father's possessions for as long as they could remember. When experts examined the piece, they confirmed it was consistent with the amber room's construction. The mosaic depicted a classical scene, executed with the kind of skill that marked the original Florentine craftsman who had worked on the room. Yet the family could provide no documentation, no proof of purchase, no explanation for how such a treasure had ended up in their home. 3 years later, another fragment surfaced, this time in Bavaria. A small carved amber panel, delicate and ornate, appeared at an estate auction. The seller claimed it had belonged to his grandfather, who had served in the Wehrmacht and had died in the 1960s. Again, there was no clear chain of provenance, no record of how the grandfather had acquired such a piece. Again, experts who examined it concluded that the craftsmanship matched that of the amber room. The coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Isolated fragments, separated by geography and time, all bearing the hallmarks of the missing treasure, all connected to families of former German officers. As researchers dug deeper, they began to follow the trails that led beyond Europe's borders. South America, particularly Argentina and Chile, had become known as havens for fleeing Nazis after the war. With the help of sympathetic officials, forged documents, and networks of supporters, thousands of war criminals had simply disappeared into new lives. They changed their names, started businesses, raised families, and they brought their treasures with them. In the mountains of Argentina, in the forests of Chile, investigators began finding compounds that had once housed these fugitives. Hidden rooms behind false walls, underground chambers accessible only through concealed passages. And in some of these spaces, they found art. In 2017, a team of researchers investigating a remote property in the Andes discovered a cache of Nazi artifacts hidden beneath a wine cellar. Among the items were paintings, jewelry, and several pieces of carved amber. The property had belonged to a man who had died in the 1970s, a German immigrant who had arrived in Chile in 1947 and lived quietly as a farmer. His true identity was eventually revealed through documents found in the hidden chamber. He had been an SS officer stationed in East Prussia. The amber pieces found in his possession were sent to experts for analysis. While the results were inconclusive, the style and age of the pieces were consistent with 18th century Russian craftsmanship. This discovery lent credence to what had long been considered a fringe theory. If one former officer had brought amber to South America, how many others had done the same? How many pieces of the amber room were sitting in private collections, their owners either unaware of their significance or deliberately concealing it? The implications were staggering. The room might not be lost at all. It might be scattered across the world, fragment by fragment, hidden in plain sight. The theory gained further traction when researchers began examining the escape routes more closely. The rat lines that spirited Nazis out of Europe were sophisticated operations, often involving the Catholic Church, sympathetic governments, and intelligence agencies that saw former Nazi officers as potential assets in the emerging Cold War. These networks didn't just move people, they moved wealth. Gold, currency, art, jewels, anything that could be converted into power or influence in a new land. The amber room, broken into pieces, would have been the perfect portable treasure. Small enough to transport, valuable enough to fund new identities, and obscure enough that individual pieces might not be immediately recognized. Today, investigators continue to follow leads that span the globe. In antique shops in Buenos Aires, auction houses in Munich, private collections in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, they search for amber pieces that match the room's description. The challenge is immense. Without documentation, without provenance, how do you prove that a particular piece once belonged to the amber room? Amber itself is difficult to date precisely. Chemical analysis can provide rough estimates, but it cannot definitively link a fragment to a specific source. And even if a piece is identified as matching the style and period of the room, proving it actually came from the amber room requires circumstantial evidence, historical documentation, and often a bit of luck. What makes this theory so unsettling is not just the possibility that the room survives in pieces, but the implication that its dispersal was deliberate, calculated, a final act of theft carried out by men who knew they were losing everything else. They could not take their power with them. They could not take their titles or their uniforms, but they could take beauty, history, and treasure. They could take something that belonged to the world and hide it away, perhaps forever. There are researchers who believe that if enough fragments could be located, if enough private collections could be examined, if enough families could be convinced to come forward with pieces they have kept hidden for generations, the amber room could be reassembled. Not as it was, perhaps, not complete, but enough to restore at least part of what was lost. The challenge is not just finding the pieces, but overcoming the silence that has protected them for more than 70 years. Some families may not even know what they possess. Others may know exactly what they have and choose to keep it secret, fearing legal repercussions, or simply unwilling to surrender something that has become part of their family history. The amber room may be the world's most famous missing treasure, but if this theory is correct, it is not missing at all. It is simply waiting, scattered across continents, hidden in basements and bank vaults, unrecognized in antique shops and private collections. Somewhere, someone may own a piece of it and not even know. Somewhere else, someone may know exactly what they have and will never tell. The room exists in fragments, a puzzle waiting for someone to solve it, a mystery that grows more complex with each passing year. And until every piece is found, until every hiding place is revealed, the amber room remains not lost, but scattered, a ghost of its former self, haunting the world in pieces. The renovations at Quedlinburg Castle in 2021 were supposed to be routine. A crew had been hired to reinforce the eastern wing's foundation, a mundane task of preserving a medieval structure that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. But on a cold morning in March, the workers discovered something that would reignite one of the greatest treasure hunts in modern history. Their jackhammers struck concrete where none should have been. According to the original architectural plans, this section of the castle's lower levels consisted of medieval stonework and earthen foundation. Yet here, deep beneath centuries-old walls, they encountered a barrier of modern concrete. Not just any concrete, but a massive seal, several feet thick, blocking what appeared to be a passageway leading further into the depths beneath the castle. The foreman halted work immediately. Something about the discovery felt wrong. The concrete was poured with precision, forming a deliberate barrier rather than any kind of structural support. Within days, specialists arrived to examine the unusual finding. What they determined sent shockwaves through the historical community and reignited decades-old whispers about what might lie hidden beneath Quedlinburg. The concrete had been poured in 1945 tide. To understand the significance of this discovery, you need to understand Quedlinburg itself. This medieval town in central Germany, with its cobblestone streets and half-timbered houses, seems an unlikely setting for one of history's greatest mysteries. But during the final chaotic months of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled, Quedlinburg became a critical node in a desperate network of hiding places. The Nazis knew the Soviets were coming from the east and the Americans from the west. They had weeks, perhaps only days, to conceal the treasures they had looted from across Europe. And the amber room was the crown jewel of all they had stolen. The legendary chamber, constructed of 6 tons of amber panels backed with gold leaf and mirrors, had been stripped from the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg in 1941. For years it had been displayed in Königsberg Castle, a twisted trophy of Nazi conquest. But by 1945, Königsberg was in the path of the Soviet advance. The room had to be moved. After that, it vanished from history. Until now, perhaps. The 2016 declassification of Nazi documents held in classified archives revealed something extraordinary. Among thousands of pages detailing the regime's final operations was a project codenamed Bernstein. In German, Bernstein means amber. The documents were fragmentary, many pages damaged or incomplete, but what survived was tantalizing. Project Bernstein involved the transport of unspecified valuable materials to a secure location for long-term storage. The operation was classified at the highest level, known only to a handful of officers in the final Nazi command structure. And the coordinates referenced in those documents pointed directly to Quedlinburg. The specificity was striking. The files mentioned a fortified location beneath a medieval structure, accessible through chambers that were to be sealed permanently. The word used was entombed. Whatever was being hidden was meant to stay hidden, perhaps forever. The operation was scheduled for late April 1945, mere weeks before Germany's surrender. When historians cross-reference these documents with the recent discovery at Quedlinburg Castle, the pieces began falling into place with disturbing precision. The concrete seal found by the renovation crew dated exactly to this time period. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted after the initial discovery, revealed something even more astonishing. Beneath the castle lie massive voids. Not small cavities or natural formations, but engineered chambers extending deep into the earth. The radar imagery shows spaces large enough to hold vehicles, or massive crates, or the panels of an ornate room. The largest void measures approximately 15 meters by 12 meters, roughly the size of the original amber room. The chambers appear to be part of a bunker system, constructed with the same engineering precision the Nazis employed in their most important underground facilities. The radar cannot penetrate the concrete seal, but it reveals the spaces beyond. Empty darkness, or perhaps the greatest treasure in European history. The question has driven researchers, treasure hunters, and government officials into increasingly heated confrontation. Because despite the mounting evidence, despite the tantalizing proximity to a potential answer, the German authorities refuse to excavate. The official explanation centers on structural concerns. Opening the seal, they claim, would destabilize the castle's foundations. The bunker system, if it exists, might collapse if exposed to air after decades of sealed containment. The risk to the medieval structure above is too great. Quedlinburg Castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its preservation must take precedence over treasure hunting. But locals tell a different story. In the bars and cafes of Quedlinburg's Old Town, people speak in hushed tones about government cover-ups and sealed orders. They point to the speed with which authorities moved to restrict access to the discovery site, the unusual presence of federal officials in a matter that should have been handled at the state level, the abrupt termination of the radar surveys just as they were producing the most interesting results. Some claim the government already knows what lies beneath the castle and has decided it must remain hidden. Perhaps the bunker contains more than just art. Perhaps there are documents, evidence of collaboration or war crimes that powerful institutions would prefer stayed buried. Or perhaps the discovery of the Amber Room would create diplomatic complications with Russia, which has spent decades attempting its own reconstruction of the lost chamber, and might claim ownership of the original if it were found. The whispers intensified when members of the team that discovered Nazi gold at Quedlinburg in the 1990s came forward with their own testimony. In 1993, a cache of medieval church treasures stolen by an American soldier was traced back to Quedlinburg. The recovery operation led investigators into previously unknown chambers beneath the town. There, they found not just the church treasures, but also crates of gold coins and bullion, hidden by the Nazis in their final days. The discovery made international headlines, but what many people don't know is what the recovery team said about what they didn't find. Heinrich Müller led that 1990s excavation. Now in his 70s, he has become increasingly vocal about his conviction that the team barely scratched the surface of what lies beneath Quedlinburg. In interviews, he describes how the tunnels they explored clearly connected to a much larger system. Passages led deeper, but were blocked by cave-ins or sealed with concrete. At one point, his team detected a void space beyond a concrete barrier, but lacked the authorization to break through. The official mission was to recover the stolen church treasures, nothing more. Miller remembers the moment vividly. They had been working in cramped, dusty tunnels for hours. The air was stale and thin. Then, one of his colleagues placed a hand against a concrete wall and felt a temperature differential. The concrete was cold, far colder than it should have been given the surrounding earth temperature. Cold enough to suggest a large empty space beyond. A space where air wasn't circulating, where temperature remained constant year-round. Perfect preservation conditions for delicate materials, like amber. They reported the finding, expecting approval to investigate further. Instead, the operation was shut down. The tunnels they had opened were resealed. Access to the site was restricted. Miller and his team were thanked for their work recovering the church treasures and told their services were no longer needed. When he pressed for explanations, he was told the remaining tunnels were unstable and too dangerous to explore further. But Miller didn't believe it then, and he doesn't believe it now. The tunnels had been stable, professionally constructed by engineers who knew their work would need to last. What the authorities really feared, he has said in recent interviews, was what would be found if the excavation continued. Now, with the 2021 discovery, Miller's old suspicions have found new light. He has publicly stated his belief that the Amber Room lies in the sealed bunker beneath Quedlinburg Castle, and that German authorities know it and have made a deliberate decision to keep it hidden. His testimony carries weight because he has been there, in the tunnels beneath the town, and has seen firsthand the scope of what the Nazis created in their final desperate weeks. Other members of the 1990s team have echoed his statements. They describe an engineered complex far more sophisticated than would be needed simply to hide stolen gold. The system suggested long-term storage, careful climate control, protection for something irreplaceable. The convergence of evidence has created a situation unlike any in the decades-long search for the Amber Room. For the first time, researchers can point to a specific location, supported by Nazi documents, physical discoveries, radar imaging, and expert testimony. The mystery, which once sprawled across multiple countries and countless theories, has narrowed to a single point beneath a medieval castle in central Germany. We are tantalizingly close to an answer, closer perhaps than we have ever been. The technology exists to excavate safely. The historical justification is overwhelming. Yet, the political will to act remains absent. This creates a unique torment for those who have devoted their lives to solving the mystery. The truth may lie just meters beneath the surface, behind a concrete seal poured in the final days of Nazi Germany. Ground-penetrating radar has shown us the shadows of what might be there. Documents have given us the code name and the location. Witnesses have testified to sealed chambers and government reluctance. Every element points toward resolution, yet resolution remains tantalizingly out of reach. Some researchers have proposed private excavations, offering to assume all risks and costs. These proposals have been denied. International preservation organizations have offered expertise and resources to ensure the work could be done without damaging the castle. Also denied. Even non-invasive investigation methods, technologies that could provide more detailed imaging of the sealed spaces, have been refused permission. The pattern of refusal has convinced many that something more than bureaucratic caution is at work. Governments, they argue, don't expend this much energy protecting structural integrity. They expend this energy protecting secrets. So we find ourselves in a maddening limbo. The greatest artistic treasure lost in World War II may be sitting in a sealed bunker, untouched since 1945, preserved in the cold darkness beneath Quedlinburg Castle. Or the bunker may be empty, another dead end in a search filled with false hopes. We have the means to know for certain, but not the permission. The Amber Room mystery, which has tormented researchers for nearly 80 years, may be approaching either its triumphant conclusion or its most frustrating chapter yet. We stand at the threshold, able to see the door but forbidden to open it. The mounting evidence suggests we have never been closer to the truth. The government's mounting resistance suggests that truth may be exactly what they fear. Beneath Quedlinburg, in the sealed darkness, something waits. Whether it is priceless treasure or empty stone, whether it is art or evidence, whether it is resolution or another layer of mystery, we cannot yet say. But the seal remains, poured by desperate men, in the final days of a collapsing empire, hiding their secrets behind concrete and time, and now, perhaps, behind the calculated reluctance of modern authorities, who have decided some doors should stay closed. The bunker waits. The truth waits. And we, tantalizingly close, yet still impossibly far, can only wonder what powerful forces might be working to ensure it stays that way. They say treasure hunts end in one of two ways: triumph or tragedy. The search for the Amber Room has known only the latter. On a cold morning in 1997, investigators found the body of treasure hunter Carl Weber locked inside his Munich apartment. The doors were bolted from within, the windows sealed. No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no explanation. Weber had spent 15 years following Nazi transport routes through Bavaria, convinced he knew where the Amber Room panels had been hidden. His notebooks, filled with maps and calculations, sat open on his desk. The final entry, dated the night before his death, contained a single line. "Tomorrow I dig." He never got the chance. 3 years earlier, across the continent in St. Petersburg, Dr. Yuri Gorelsky collapsed in his university office. Heart attack, the medical examiner concluded, though Gorelsky was 41 years old, an athlete with no history of cardiac disease. His colleagues whispered about the phone call he'd received that morning, how his face had gone white as he listened, how he'd sent everyone away and locked his door. On his desk, they found burned papers, the ashes of documents he'd spent months compiling. Research into wartime German military movements. Transport manifests. Railway schedules leading east from Königsberg. All of it reduced to cinders. The pattern stretches back decades, a catalog of misfortune that reads less like coincidence and more like design. In 1987, Georg Stein, a former German soldier who'd served in East Prussia, contacted several museums and historical societies. He claimed to possess information about the Amber Room's final location, knowledge he'd kept secret for over 40 years. He scheduled interviews, prepared documents, set a date to reveal everything he knew. 5 days before his planned announcement, someone shot him dead outside his home in Frankfurt. The killer was never found. Stein's documents, if they ever existed, disappeared. The deaths aren't always violent. Sometimes they're disturbingly mundane. Car accidents on straight roads in perfect weather. Falls from modest heights that somehow prove fatal. Sudden illnesses that strike down healthy researchers in the prime of their investigations. Each incident arrives at the precise moment when a searcher claims to be close, when breakthrough seems imminent, when revelation hovers just beyond reach. Is the Amber Room cursed? The question hangs over every new search expedition, like smoke. Or is there something more deliberate at work, human hands engineering these tragedies to keep the treasure buried? Both explanations terrify in different ways. A curse suggests forces beyond our control, ancient powers guarding stolen beauty. But conspiracy implies watchers, silent guardians who spent decades ensuring the Amber Room remains unfound. Which is worse, supernatural vengeance or mortal ruthlessness spanning generations? The Russian government clearly believes the treasure still exists. They spent over $12 million creating a painstaking replica, reconstructing the amber panels piece by piece for the Catherine Palace. Yet even as tourists marvel at the recreation, official search teams continue combing through wartime records, following leads, investigating theories. Why build a copy if you've abandoned hope for the original? The replica stands as both tribute and placeholder, beauty recreated while the authentic marvel remains missing. Somewhere in the darkness, 6 tons of carved amber still exists. The laws of physics assure us of this. Amber doesn't simply vanish. It endures for millions of years after all, preserving ancient insects and prehistoric secrets. The panels that once reflected candlelight in a Russian palace, that survived transport and occupation and war, must be somewhere. Perhaps crushed beneath tons of rubble in Königsberg's ruins. Perhaps resting in silt at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, swallowed when a fleeing ship went down. Perhaps sealed inside a bunker no one has yet discovered, waiting in perfect darkness. Or scattered across the globe, divided among private collectors who will never admit what they possess. The mystery protects itself now, wrapped in layers of tragedy and time. Each failed search adds another warning to those who might come after. Each unexplained death whispers a single message: some questions are dangerous to ask. And perhaps the Amber Room has decided, through curse or conspiracy or sheer, impossible fortune, that it prefers the dark. Perhaps some treasures, having witnessed enough of human greed and violence, choose to remain lost. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.